everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Saurabh Gupta, and I appreciate your time. I have with me Jonathan and Tim, and we'll get into introductions shortly. So this conversation is really interesting. While we are going to talk a lot from a higher ed and nonprofit specific perspective, what we are talking about has a much broader implication when you think about enterprises that have multiple Salesforce orgs. Data privacy and security is definitely becoming an important topic, and that's what we're going to cover. If you have any questions while we are going through this, please do type in the chat window, and then we can definitely get to them at the end of this session. And if we don't cover them there, then we'll definitely reach out to you via LinkedIn, or you can send us an email. Our emails will be also shared. So with that, let's get into it. Jonathan, if you go to the next slide, please. So let me start off with a disclaimer. This event is coordinated by Cloud Compliance. We are a Salesforce partner, and we are going to talk about data privacy and security, particularly a lot of privacy laws and their implications that will be covered too. This is not legal advice. This entire thing is meant to be informational. And what we are sharing is just our point of view based on what we have heard, from Salesforce customers, our own research, and a lot of these kind of things that Jonathan and Tim have also heard from customers seen in their experience with the enterprises and things like that. Next, please. So a little bit about who we are. We are Cloud Compliance. We are an App Exchange ISV partner. So we are a product company focused on Salesforce data privacy and security. We offer data privacy applications that are 100% on the Salesforce platform, primarily designed for complex and large Salesforce enterprises. And most of our products are fairly declarative, so our customers can go live in a matter of weeks. Next, please. So my name is Saurabh Gupta. I am the CEO and co-founder of Cloud Compliance. Prior to starting Cloud Compliance, I was a colleague of Jonathan and Tim at Salesforce, spent about 7.5 years there, and a fair part of it between .com and Salesforce.org. So I've had the opportunity to firsthand work with a lot of higher ed and nonprofit customers and understand their challenges and kind of operate in that space. By trade, I'm an enterprise architect. I am based out of Chicago. With that, I'll turn it over to, one more slide. So we've been very fortunate with Salesforce.org customers. We've had the honor of serving some of the finest there in the higher ed space and with nonprofits. So Norwegian Refugee Council is a nonprofit that I really, really like their mission and what they do worldwide. To support refugees and a lot of people in trying times, we've worked with organizations like that and with St. Louis University EF Education First to help with their GDPR requirements and CCPA, CPR, and other sort of data privacy requirements. So I think that's enough about me. I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Yeah, hi, my name's Jonathan Maher. I'm a principal solution engineer, part of the Salesforce.org team. Most of my career has been in higher education, and the last 12 or so years of that has been specifically with Salesforce. Had the privilege of leading implementations all across the country, and really excited to be part of this conversation. You'll hear a little more from me later, but for now, let me hand it over to my colleague, Tim.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Hey, everyone. My name is Tim Weeks. I'm the Industry Solutions Director for Nonprofit Operations here at Salesforce. And I've been in the nonprofit and technology space for over 15 years now, working in consulting, in industry, and of course now at Salesforce. I'm based out of Philly, and I'm excited that all of you have decided to join and chat with us about this really important topic. So if you can go to the next slide. So what I want to do to kick off here before I hand it over to Jonathan, is going to go a little bit deeper into the problem statement, is set some context for where we're at in terms of privacy and security of data. I'm going to launch with an overarching statement. We can see data as a challenge or a solution. And this goes for every institution, nonprofit, education, and how that institution chooses to manage the security and compliance of that data, all those valuable assets that are entrusted to us, makes the difference, all the difference in an institution's success and their ability to grow and deepen constituent engagement. So I think about this as 4 key imperatives or drivers of why this is so important right now. First, institutions across the globe are looking to digitally transform. And because of this, they're collecting and actioning on more data than ever. And this data is sitting across many systems, so their infrastructure footprint is growing. So I guess you could say a multi-system approach is expected. So this could be multiple Salesforce orgs and multiple apps, but that footprint is growing. Second, the pandemic has really normalized the concept of a remote workforce. And I think we can all talk to the benefits of being employees in a hybrid work environment, or if you're an employer, how that's helped you. But we can't ignore that it also introduces expanded data and security concerns. Number 3, education and nonprofit institutions today have global reach. They're working with constituents from around the world. And that data that they're working with is governed by an increasingly complex matrix of compliance rules and regulations that need to be understood, but not just understood, but operationalized in their business. And finally, number 4, and honestly, this is listed as number 4, but it might be the most important. This goes way beyond just regulatory compliance. This is really about putting trust at the center of mission. An institution's brand is at stake here. And by not or choosing not to protect stakeholder data and giving the constituent control over their own information, every institution risks eroding funding, program, and reputation success. And if we just think about the vulnerable populations that nonprofits and even education institutions are working with every day, this is almost a moral imperative to properly protect and honor this data. So I'll stop there. I think we could agree it's a critical topic, but I also think it's a complex topic. If we go to the next slide. So this is a bit of an eye chart to look at. So I'm not going to ask you to try to read it really quickly, but I want to call out here is that Saurabh and the team at Cloud Compliance have developed this lightweight guide to help organizations kind of kickstart their thinking on how global regulations intersect with data and business processes. So I'm assuming the deck in some way will be shared after this call, or it could be requested. You can take a look at this on your own. But I really like this grid because I think it's a great way to start a collaborative conversation institution-wide at your own nonprofit, at your own education institution, or if you're a consultant with your clients, to really start to surface some of the concerns and like I said, take a look after this webinar.
Before I go to the next slide, I do want to call out, I know it's an eye chart, but column 4 there, cross-border enforcement. Like if you're on this call kind of thinking, well, when will this apply to me? It applies now. And if you are serving you have constituents in any of these regions, these laws apply to you now. So yeah, all 4 of those are checked for those laws, and it's likely to continue to be the trend as new laws come online. Just want to make sure we call that out of the eye chart. Back to you, Jim.
No, it's a great point, Jonathan. And I'm based in the US, and I know we have an international crew on the phone right now, but even in just the US, there are 28, last I checked, laws pending in state legislations that are going to change the way that organizations have to think about data compliance. So critical. But complex. If we kind of start to shift this conversation back to the topic we set out to talk about today, which is really data compliance and security in a multi-system architecture or multi-system enterprise, I started out talking about 4 key imperatives, and I acknowledge that education and nonprofit institutions by design are embracing this multi-system approach. So data is in a lot of places, and they might be doing this for a lot of different reasons. Some folks have different systems that serve a unique function, maybe like a recruiting app or a fundraising app or even advocacy and marketing. Or maybe your institution manages different types of constituents in different systems or Salesforce orgs. Some international organizations might decide, or multinational, might decide to segment by region or country their infrastructure. And federated organizations may elect to have a system design that might mirror their chapter or department structure. So all these reasons, and no matter the reason, there's really great validity and purpose to a multi-system or multi-org approach. But with this approach needs to be an understanding and appreciation for the data security and privacy challenges it will present. So with that foundation in place, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Jonathan, who's going to go a level deeper.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Just kind of re-emphasizing the realities that you outlined, right? One big reality, you did a great job outlining, is that privacy and security regulation must be addressed. I love that you called out the brand and moral imperative to be protecting our data, right? So we have to deal with this. This has to be addressed. We can't kick the can down the road. And the other reality you called out, right, is that multi-system infrastructures it's the norm. It's the norm in our industry, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. So what specific challenges come up thinking about a multi-system environment when it comes to data security and privacy, and what is the right solution to address those challenges? So I want to use this as a little bit of a lens to kind of break apart the different types of challenges that are there when you're thinking about multi-system challenges that we're all facing. One is the idea of data privacy, and there's also the idea of data security. So data privacy is it's a newer thing, right, with regulations like GDPR, where in the law, individuals have a right to issue a data subject access request, and they can reach out and say to you as an organization, what do you know about me? I want a download of my information. They also could ask the right to be forgotten, right? I'd like you to purge the information you have about me. That privacy thing is a newer regulation and is definitely a challenge. And something that's been prevalent for a long time, and there's been laws like CAN-SPAM in the United States and other email laws that consent and opt-in management from a privacy perspective, right? That we are logging and maintaining a record that a constituent has given us permission to communicate with them in a certain kind of way. That is an older challenge, but it's becoming more real, and there's more teeth to violation of that consent and opt-in management with the new laws that are coming. And there's also the data security, right? We're all very comfortable with the cloud, but data security has been a long-running concern. And so some of the specific things, thinking about your data retention policies, the more data you have, the more risk there is. If you're using a sandbox environment, is that data masked in a way that's ensuring that people that are in the sandbox for legitimate reasons to do development don't have access to sensitive information. The idea of ring fencing, you have VIP constituents inside of your org, or someone that has made a request to have their information sequestered off from the majority of your staff. Do you have a framework for doing that? And then also looking at user deprovisioning, right? From a security perspective, you have these systems with sensitive private data inside of it. How are you making sure that when someone leaves the organization, you're pulling them out of the access and really thinking about your data loss prevention strategies? So this is another view of that first challenge I talked about, the data privacy challenge. So here's the reality in a multi-system environment. You have personal data about your constituents all over the place, right? If you're very familiar with Salesforce, there's the different Salesforce objects that you have that, but there's also different systems that you'll have that personal information in. And then the other challenge on this is that there's different identifiers for that individual constituent. So if you have a person's information in multiple systems without a single identifier, you're ultimately kind of out of compliance right out of the gate, right? We don't have a framework for immediately knowing what information we have about a given constituent, because we don't know where that information is stored. We haven't cataloged that, and we haven't mapped that individual constituent's information in each of the different areas. So this is a significant challenge without that mapping and without a master data management solution or a federated identifier. So that's a real challenge and a reality that in a lot of ways, if a person made a data subject access request, said, tell me what you know about me, many organizations have a very manual process trying to comply with that, trying to pull that out. And ultimately that means you're out of compliance. And then thinking about data security, this is another lens on that as well. There's two important security concepts here: the idea of masking your sandbox data so that people that shouldn't have access to private information don't, and then your policies around retaining production data. But the reality is that you don't have to think about that for one specific system. You have to think about that in multiple different systems. So there's some specialized work that may be required to comply depending on a system. And how are you managing that complexity? How are you thinking about how to move forward with that? So it's not a small challenge in any way. So what's the answer here? And it's a kind of a two-step process. The first thing is that you really do need a center of excellence, right? In a multi-system enterprise, you do need that center of excellence that would centralize and do things like approve new systems that you're bringing into the ecosystem. We already stated that multi-system ecosystems are the norm, and sometimes that can be optimal, but you should have a governance group that is deciding what new tools you bring to bear and making sure that when those new tools come in, they're being brought in a way that is compliant. How is privacy and security being managed for those new systems? And the reality is a lot of us have a lot of backward looking work to do as well with the systems that we already have that are part of our ecosystem. And there needs to be a centralized group that's thinking about how that's being managed, how that's being mapped. So that's the first part of this. But there also has to be a technology component to instantiating the policies and procedures and the mappings that the Center of Excellence makes. And that's really where this second part, a hub org, is a place where that compliance can be tracked. So the Center of Excellence makes the policy, Center of Excellence keeps an eye on governance and approves new systems coming in. But the hub org is where that compliance can be tracked and managed. This would also be the place where you can tie together the identities from different systems to help you comply with privacy. And it would also be a place where you're literally just tracking your level of security compliance. For some of these spokes, right, if it's a Salesforce instance, some of that mapping can be pretty natural. You can kind of do it once from a policy perspective, and you make sure that you're capturing all that information. But there may be special circumstances with some external applications, right? And developing a policy and procedure for how you execute a right to be forgotten request. And having a place to centrally manage that really is critical from a people perspective, which is the Center of Excellence, but also from a technology and tracking perspective, which is what that hub org could allow you to do. And the power of a hub strategy really is becoming increasingly common for those kind of familiar with the Salesforce value proposition. In a lot of ways, Salesforce technologies are used to provide kind of a hub as a single view of the customer, kind of from a marketing and engagement standpoint. Our friends over at Capado, who is an ISV on Salesforce, they provided a hub for release management as another example. And we just talked about the idea of the necessary investments in a hub for data privacy and security. And Saurabh will now show you how they built a package that does exactly that and allows you to execute against the strategy from a technology perspective that we just outlined. So let me hand it over to Saurabh.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So, really that's the perspective that we were provided by customers in the last 3 years, right? If you are a university, you have, the med school, the business school, and so on and so forth. And every one of those, schools have their own Salesforce org. They may have their own marketing cloud or Pardot or some other email marketing technology. And before you know, you have this massive spread of information all across these systems. If you're a nonprofit, it's the same story, right? You may have organized yourself by countries, by regions, or by fundraising versus some other similar departments. And again, for your constituents, for your students, for the engagement platforms, the impact platforms, and all of those layers that you're trying to transform with, you have this information spread everywhere. And, along comes GDPR, CCPA, CPRA, all the other 4-letter acronyms all across the world. And here you are trying to comply. And, what we've heard particularly from any sort of a enterprise that has, a multiple of these systems, which is practically everyone in the mid to, large size enterprise space today. And all of them are trying to figure out, how do we come up with a strategy for data management in this life cycle, and how do we comply with these regulations? And as Jonathan and Tim so eloquently stated earlier, it's all about the brand and the trust, particularly for nonprofits and higher ed. That plays so much more than any other industry that I can think of. Right? We are putting for our kids and ourselves, we are putting our future in the hands of higher education institutions. we are putting our trust in making an impact and goodwill with nonprofits. So when you think of it from a right to be forgotten and portability request perspective, it's really the idea that you've now received a request and by law you're required to comply with it and to give someone a copy of their data or remove their information from all the systems that you have internally. So how does this play out from an architecture perspective? Jonathan, if you would, next, please. So this is a very classic example. You have maybe an external master system, which is the purple oval on the very left. It could be a OneTrust or Sano. It may be some homegrown system. It may be your, school's website where someone can make a request, or for a nonprofit, their website, your constituents can make a request there. And let's say you made a request to get a copy of your data, and you have 3 or 4 Salesforce orgs and a marketing cloud instance and maybe some other systems. And now this request needs to somehow get broadcasted across to these orgs. Appropriate information needs to be pulled back and collected and returned to the data subject, the requester. This is where the challenge is today. Really, you either have to do this manually, which is really not scalable and quite expensive and error prone sometimes, or you have to build custom integrations all across the board. You have to figure out for each of these systems, their context. I may be identifying students by student ID in a Salesforce org. I may be identifying them by email in some other org, or by date of birth, or by social, or whatever other identifiers you can think of. And as organically nonprofits have evolved, and there's been such a thrust post-COVID on investing more and more in technology and digital outreach, this problem has increasingly become more complex. So what we are doing is, you have a Salesforce hub org, a designated hub org that receives this request. It takes into consideration those identifiers, and in this hub org, we actually have configured it. So each of the org that this hub is connecting to, your spoke org. So if I take a higher example, my spoke orgs are the Salesforce org in the business school, in the med school, in the liberal arts, and so on, all of those particular departments or schools, right? So for each of those orgs, one of them may be using contacts or leads or, some other custom object. You may have, an enrollment RX, you may have NPSP, EDA, or, some other variant of all of these kind of packages. And you may be identifying people differently. All of that logic of how people are identified in specific spoke orgs is captured in the hub. So hub now has the intelligence to invoke with very specific identifiers in the context of the orgs from which that information is requested, either to be pulled back or to be removed. So that's the gist of how this architecture works. We do have a demo of showing how all of this comes together. And before I get into that, Jonathan, next slide.
I do want to hijack a little bit too. I want to call out something I love so much about this framework, this architecture, is that it's flexible and it can be implemented in phases. I think it's really important if you look at the connective tissue between the hub org and those spoke orgs. Source built out an incredible piece of technology with these applications that help you manage the mapping and the API call out that says, hey, this individual has made a request to be forgotten, and we need to reach into the business school org in order to pull back their information. That mapping could all be done and managed with cloud compliance. But continuing the school example, there's probably a real big external application there, right? The student information system or the student record system that's built with different sets of technologies. And it may be that in phase one, the sad reality is you can't fully automate it because that thing just doesn't have an API to do a data subject access removal request, or it just hasn't been built out yet. So that would be kind of manual process where the business school one is fully automated. And then as later phases, you could use tools like MuleSoft or custom development to then fully automate the outreach into the student information system. So that flexibility means that you could get started quickly, accelerate time to value with your Salesforce ecosystem, and then add on automations to your other systems. And then already we talked about the center of excellence kind of being there to approve new technologies to be brought into the ecosystem. this kind of approach gives you the flexibility to bring in any kind of technology, and then you'd have a project for making sure that that new member of the technology family that's engaging your constituents is able to be compliant. So I think this architecture really does give you that, which is pretty compelling.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jonathan, because both Jonathan and I have, and Tim, we've kind of been in the trenches for so long, particularly with these sort of things. And one, you definitely want a phased approach, and you can show success and build upon that success. And the other part of this is, as you see those arrows going from the hub to external app or to Salesforce, where it says REST API or MuleSoft. And that's the trick, right? Like like this whole architecture works well with whatever your existing set of capabilities is. If you have investments in MuleSoft, this approach plays nice with that. If you have investment in Kafka or something else, it works with them. If you've not done any of those integrations yet, we are basically just calling REST APIs, so you can just directly call them. And by doing that sort of an approach, we are trying to lower these sort of entry barriers to to get to automation for privacy and to kind of get the value earlier. Thank you, Jonathan, for that call out. Tim, is there anything you would like to add to this before we move on?
I think the only thing I'll add is, and this might be more applicable to our nonprofit customers, well, we said that maybe multinational nonprofits will look at this hub and spoke model. I think we should not dismiss this for mid-sized nonprofits that might be more regionally focused. And I call it that top box, those external apps. Nonprofits are famous for storing data across dozens of external apps and collecting data in non-governed ways. So while you could think of a hub and spoke model with Salesforce orgs, you can also think of a hub and spoke model, which is a bevy of ISV and external apps that need to be governed in the same way and can be. So two sides to the same coin, but I just don't want for some of our nonprofit listeners here that think, I don't have a multi-Salesforce system. This still applies and is still relevant. So that's the only call out I'd make here.
Yeah,
Sure.
Great point.
Good.
And for any smaller universities too, right? You may, we just have our student information system and one CRM, like that you have data in multiple places, and the laws don't not apply because you have limited resources, unfortunately.
True. And a lot of what we are showing here is really, because your hub is based on Salesforce, and if you have Salesforce capabilities within your organization, you are leveraging on them, right? This isn't some new esoteric thing that you have to learn to deliver on this. So a little bit more on the hub and the spoke. We've kind of used those terms for a bit here. So think of spoke app as your line of business, Salesforce orgs or other systems that are, for your school, various schools or for various, nonprofit functions or different nonprofits, however they're structured, right? And the idea of the spoke app, what we've built is it's a managed package that gets deployed in your actual production org there. And so all the processing of privacy requests is happening in the context of those orgs. So, whatever, kind of configuration exists, however you're identifying contacts or leads or users or some other, custom or managed package objects that you have. So all of that is happening in the context of those within the spoke. The hub org is orchestrating all of this, right? So that's where the request initially comes in, and it sends this request out to spokes. Stuff happens, we get a response back, and the hub then has this complete auditability of what was the request, where did I send it out to, what sort of responses I got, and the eventual collection of all of that information that can be collated and provided to the requester. So I think this is really it. We can jump into the demo next.
So this is the example of a dashboard. And the idea here is, if you have a data protection officer, if you have a CISO, if you have other folks who need a bird's eye view of how are we doing in privacy and security, they can take a look at it. Like in this particular case, since this demo is talking about portability and right to be forgotten, what you're seeing is that what's the number of requests that came in, right? What's the average processing time it's taking us? What are the requests which have been on hold for a while? where you may run into a risk of violating, privacy laws. Because with GDPR, you need to respond back in 30 days. And with other laws, that number varies. What you're also starting to see is how we are tackling it for various different objects. As these requests come into the hub and they are sent out to these different spoke orgs, you can see we are reaching out to the contact object or the individual object or leads, users, custom objects, so on and so forth. You can also see how many are we processing? Are we running into errors when we are doing these requests? And you can also look at these spoke orgs. So like in this example, this hub org is connecting to these couple of different orgs, so Maher org, APAC, and EMEA org. And you can see what kind of statuses are coming up. So let's take an example of how this looks. So these are the two requests that I'm going to show. Obviously, this takes quite a long while to do it real time. So I'm going to show you how these requests look from a post-mortem perspective, if you will. So I'm going to dive into a right to be forgotten request that came in from an external system. So it does have an external identifier. If you need to, our API send back the record ID of this record. So your external system will keep that. The point is there is a full traceability for an external system of what request I sent, what's going on with it. And in the request that came, there were a bunch of data subject identifiers. You had phone number, first name, last name, email address. You may have an e-commerce identifier, a device, whatever it is that your particular business uses, you can send those identifiers into the hub org. And what the hub org then does is it turns around and looks at the configuration of various spoke orgs. So it's looking at the APAC org and it knows the APAC org uses contact and lead. So it's going to send this information, specific information. It knows, it needs to send a first name and a last name for contact or an email address or just an email address for leads. So it's applying that level of contextual org specific intelligence here. Similarly for EMEA org, it's going against contact and lead. For Maher org against lead and contact. In the LATAM org, they use individual. So it's going against the individual record there, which is again a Salesforce standard object. And in a number of cases, it may not find a record, just the nature of things. You don't have this person in these orgs, but in certain orgs and for certain object, it does find a record. And when that happens, the cloud compliance spoke app that is running in the EMEA org creates a case, a DSAR type case, and essentially sends back a case ID. And then it processes that record and all of that status is updated here. So what you're looking at here is the complete auditability of going against 4 orgs or 40 and seeing specific statuses coming back from this. So you now have a complete view that you can refer to. And if you need to prove that you actually did go through and enforce a privacy policy, and it's going to be the same for security. If you were trying to look at this from, how many of my sandboxes are masked, how much data retention has been run, what is the degree of coverage of these things, how many legal hold do I have? It's the same approach, the same framework, and we are able to provide you with this view across the board. And once you've done this, let's take a look at another request, which is going to be a portability request. So very quickly, again, very same idea. Request came in, it's got an external identifier. It's got some first name, last name. And, these are the requests we created, right? And what happens in this case is it's going to go against those orgs and it is going to make a request for data. And, there were portability files that got generated and we got back a JSON version of it. I'm going to show that in a minute. So at this point, let me go back into one of the spoke requests. And inside this request, you can see what we sent. So we sent, this is the status. It was processed, didn't find any record. This is kind of the query that we had sent in for this object. And this was the org that we went against. So this is kind of, right, the more detailed view of the spoke request. Let me actually show you a sample of one of these as they come back. So in portability, this is an example of the JSON that came back from a spoke org. We did this extract on that org, and we are coming back with the, some contact records here for this person. We may have other kind of records. So this is the related asset record, again, a standard object. So this contact has this asset, and you can also see a custom object, a transaction object. So essentially what we have done is we've gone there and extracted out all of this information and presented that to our end users. And this is kind of how this multi-org hub and spoke model works really well. And we are now working with some of the largest companies in the world that are trying to do this. And this is the degree of complexity that they're able to address with this across privacy and security.
Yeah, so that's really, the short demo on this. I have a question here from Chatwayer on, for the hub spoke model, would we recommend an essential edition devoted for the hub app? And the answer is a bit of it depends. With most customers, what we have seen is they already have a dedicated org because they have Copado or they're doing some other stuff on it. This is a pretty lightweight org because all we're doing there is installing this app, and so you may have a few licenses there just to receive requests, configure it, have an admin type person view it, maybe have some from data privacy or a CISO looking at it, but essentially that's all that's happening. So a little bit of these are all, everything that we talked about is on App Exchange. Here is a link to our app, the sort of the main app which runs on your Spoke org and does the right to be forgotten portability. We already do retention and a bunch of other things which you can do on Spoke org. Next, please. And this is the Multiorg security hub that we released recently, and we are working with customers on adding more functionality here. And this is what's orchestrates everything that's happening on your Spoke org. The link for this is in the chat in case you want to take a look. Next, please. And finally, we also do sandbox data masking. So there is a free, again, on-platform app that is available. Salesforce also has a sandbox data masking app. So you have a bunch of choices there, and just wanted you guys to be aware of that. I think that's really it. Jonathan, if you go to the next slide. Yeah. So you can reach out to us on info@cloudcompliance.app, and we'll share a Calendly link also here in case you want to have a conversation on this. At this point, I think we can open this up for any questions or comments that anyone has. Jonathan and Tim, if you want to add something, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely interested to hear some questions. One comment I just wanted to make, as someone that has been in the trenches working on Salesforce apps for so long, looking at the demo and just seeing these are all Salesforce objects, and knowing that if we needed to, for our business use case, we could add a new custom field. If we needed to do some manual processes and track that a human was doing the work, we could use Flow, use all those declarative tools inside of Salesforce. Kind of gave me a warm and fuzzy feeling, because this is a hard job to do, but it really does, and has, as I've understood this problem, seemed like a CRM problem to solve, right? Managing these requests, processing these requests, a powerful CRM is the right place to house that. And seeing the tremendous work you've done, getting customers 95% of the way there, but knowing that it's on a platform that extra 5% can be tweaked the way it needs to, it makes it seem a little less scary as a challenge.
Yeah, and the thing I like about this approach is, you already have Salesforce, right? Like, it just, instead of adding yet another system, figuring out its nuances, having a dev environment, a test environment, and all of that, this kind of builds upon your existing investments in skill set, in infrastructure, and all the paraphernalia for Salesforce that you have, and it deepens, your ability to do these things and automate them. And it also gives you a better return on your Salesforce investment, because most higher ed school institutions, most nonprofits are trying to extend that technology investment that they've already made. So one of the questions that I commonly get about this entire approach is, how well does this work, and are there sort of security concerns going between different orgs and different systems? And this is today designed to utilize either an OAuth or a JWT type security authorization. So we have flexibility there to work with whatever your security and infrastructure folks would like to do. and these are all happening between, Salesforce to Salesforce or Salesforce to your other internal systems, and essentially whatever authentication scheme you prefer to use, we can work with that. Reaching to other systems which are non-Salesforce systems, like if you have an SIS or if you have other homegrown systems or some third-party systems, we support Apex as one of the mechanisms. So you have all the ability to make REST calls, SOAP calls, whatever it is that those specific, technologies would need. Are there any questions on any of this that we can answer? Are these actually relevant challenges for the audience on this call?
As folks are typing in the chat, I'm gonna throw one other thing out there that I think I circled around, but I want to put a finer point on it. Between Salesforce technology and our ISV partners like Saurabh, there are solutions out here to really lock down data privacy and security. But I just think it's always important to remember that when a nonprofit or an education institution is looking to make an investment, not just in a tool, but a process that changes the way they work, it's a culture shift and it's an investment. And it may take some changes in the way the organization thinks about their work. And for that to happen, there has to be a driver behind it. And I was talking to a customer last week, and we were both kind of chuckling that we both came across the same website, the National Cybersecurity Alliance, which is like a professional association. But the thing that struck us was that they were encouraging consumers to control their data, to go to the folks that they interacted with and say, I want to be forgotten when they completed working with them, or I want a download of my data and I want to know how it's being used, or I want to control my preferences. And while some nonprofits may be exempt from some laws and there's lots of nuance there, I think we're going to see more and more customers becoming savvy. Just like you check your credit report every year, you're going to check your data health every year. So I think there's a moment to get ahead of the curve here. And however you decide to tackle this challenge, now's the time to get there, because you don't want to be behind the eight ball. You don't want to be chasing this. You want to be ahead of the curve. So I think it's just really important for especially all the nonprofits on the call today to be really knowing this is important. It's only going to grow in importance. So now's the time to start talking to your leadership and changing the posture that you have at your organization around data security. So I just wanted to make sure that I added that, because it's not just technology. It's also really changing the way we think about the data security in our organizations.
That's a really good point.
Security. Like data security and data strategy, right? Like I love that point, Tim, because it is a cultural shift and a cultural change. And I think there's as you're advocating in your organization to do things better for your constituents, there's been an argument about centralizing data and having kind of this unified view. There's reasons so we can understand our constituents better. We can provide a better constituent experience with a unified preference center. These are all kind of arguments for doing it, but there is cultural barriers. People don't want to share. They don't want to consolidate. There's just investment barriers, right? This is not a trivial thing to do. And so I think that the compliance, the trust, the brand piece, like as you're making those arguments for making these really critical investments, like to me, this is another strong bullet point for why an institution needs to move. And on some levels, it's getting ahead of the curve, and some levels, it's catching up to the rest of industry when it comes to having that kind of unified data strategy.
Yeah, didn't Tim or Jonathan, didn't one of you mention like a stat that was published recently by Salesforce.org on data strategy? Wasn't it like 2/3 of nonprofits don't have?
75% roughly of nonprofits don't have a comprehensive data strategy, which is a non-starter in many ways. So like I said, there's a culture shift, but it's incremental, but it's just really important to be having these conversations in your organization and really bringing this up as an important factor in the way you deliver mission.
True. And I think even with higher eds, one of the challenges is, if you're a higher ed that has global student population applying, you automatically need to comply with the Brazilian laws, the European laws, Chinese laws, anywhere, when you have data, you're processing of residents of a specific region or a country that has a regulation that starts to apply, even if you're just, a higher ed based in United States, or whatever, region you're based in. The other part that I find quite interesting, last year, my son applied to like 12, 13 colleges, and the sheer amount of information that higher ed needs for admissions is mind-boggling. I did not realize, because for FAIRPA, for scholarships, for loans, you are providing financial information not only of the student but their family, right? As a parent, I had to disclose my income, my assets, my liabilities, all those things. It was like as if you were applying for a home mortgage, really. The third portion of that is, once someone gets admitted to a higher ed school, there's a ton of health information, allergies, right? Sexual preferences, gender orientation, like a ton of information with more additional laws that gets applied. I find that also true for nonprofits that work in some specific segments where there is health information, where there is a lot of other very, very sensitive information. So I think when you think of the broader construct, we've only specifically touched on right to be forgotten and portability here, but when you think about data security in general, whether you're trying to do retention, you're trying to do consent management, opt-in, opt-outs, you're trying to do sandbox data masking, all of these things that we've worked in the last 3 years, what we have found is particularly nonprofits and higher eds have a greater degree of sensitivity to it compared to like a B2B organization, where you don't have a lot of personal health related information or other kind of very sensitive information. I was just curious if somebody had a comment on that. Any other questions did we answer here? I'm curious if there's anyone on the call who's got a perspective to share, particularly for higher ed or nonprofit, or just in general on data security, privacy. All right. Going once.
I'll take that as either we nailed it and there's nothing more to say, or they disagree with us so strongly they don't want to come off mute for fear of being angry. So let's assume it was the former, and I think we're good. Oh, we got it, nailed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. I was wondering if Kim or someone would share their perspective, because I know they have had a lot of experience in this space. So I was curious too. I was just waiting for that to happen. No? Yeah.
I think my perspective, just from the schools that I've worked with, that it's just very confusing, and there's so many rules, and they just don't know where to start because they have so many different data centers. And this was just makes it so much simpler. Specifically, what I was excited about when we first met was that it's Salesforce out of the box objects. It's not a whole custom package set on top with a bunch of more, technical debt, but really simplifies it in my mind.
Yeah, no, and I know Kim, you and I have spoken with some of .org customers about it, and I agree. I think there is so much going on in that world that it's hard for customers to figure out where do we start and how much do we do. And that's why I think what Jonathan was mentioning earlier about a phased approach is so profound. That is frankly, that is the only way it gets done for so many of our customers, right? It's just near impossible for them to like, all right, stop the press and we're going to go and just do this thing entirely in one shot, right? There's this gradual, small, incremental value that they can get and orient themselves to be more, privacy conscious, more data security aware, and add practices and automation to address that.
And some of the older institutions have a lot of old data.
Yes.
Yes.
Many years, 100 years of data. So
yes,
it's overwhelming.
And with the new regulations, particularly in GDPR, has specific things around data minimization and data retention. I know CPRA, the new version of California's CCPA, which will get enforced on, from 2023. It will have a look back to all the data collected in 2022. And, I think data retention and minimization is making its way into the US. I think the bit of a challenge for institutions and organizations based in the US is the fact that we don't have a federal privacy law, at least not yet, right? So I think Tim was mentioning that earlier, there is a ton of them right now, right? Oregon has one, Minnesota, Texas, Virginia, of course, California, and there's probably Oklahoma has one, Illinois has a cyber law around data privacy. There's a lot of that's happening, and I think it'll continue to happen. From where I sit, it seems like a great opportunity. But I think for customers, it's just that space is going to get more and more challenging. And the sooner, they can start orienting themselves to these challenges, probably puts them in a better position. Are there other areas you're seeing, Kim, that are challenging or, for the customers when they think about data privacy, security, just data strategy in general?
Well, I think that, seeing the hub and spoke model that you just hadn't seen that yet, but I think that really, as much as some schools want to have one org, it's just not realistic, and it's okay. Like you guys said, it's okay. You can have more than one org. And just seeing a way to be able to architect that and be successful.
Yeah, I agree. I see your hand raised.
Yeah, that's me. Hi, Basil. Yeah. So I want to come down to maybe to a more basic level, because we've talked a lot about the hub and spoke, Lynch Capado with CI and CD and all of that. And I work with a lot of very large federated organizations. And we often tell our customers, you don't have to be a development or operation to benefit from Salesforce or from Salesforce. And I'm wondering, what are the strategies that we have at the more fundamental multi-org level to help people connect these orgs and do this work without having to code it all? I mean, obviously MuleSoft is an option, but are there other strategies? Are there other ways at a more basic level to start tying these things together that we can help our customers with? Because then it would enable the national headquarters to really provide more services to their affiliates, right? And then they can help manage all of these things. But right now, we can't even get to that point in a lot of cases. So do we have thoughts about that? And then, of course, the privacy stuff is all incredibly important, but any thoughts about the more basic aspect of things and how we pull that off and how we can help make that happen?
So let me ask a counter question, then I'm curious if Jonathan or Tim has a perspective they'd share. So what you're describing is you're talking about like large organizations that have a bunch of systems in there, and your question is really around how do we synchronize information between them?
No, it would be so it would sort of be the same model as a school. So let's pretend we're talking about the University of Texas. And the University of Texas has Salesforce orgs for the College of Liberal Arts, the Department of History, the Department of Government. They have for the College of Natural Sciences and for physics and chemistry and all these different Salesforce orgs. And the UT's Office of Technology wants to run a Salesforce multi-org strategy where they're helping these people set up and manage all of these orgs so that the individual departments and colleges don't have to do it, right? Which is something I think that, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe that doesn't happen in higher ed, but that was what I thought we were sort of talking about they were doing in higher ed earlier in the webinar. The same thing applies to large federated organizations like the Goodwills, the Big Brothers Big Sisters, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, these large federated organizations where they have very small chapters that don't have the budgets for the people to really run technology, but they have larger offices that can on the national level, but they don't want to create managed packages. They don't want to pay for the infrastructure to do like a MuleSoft deployment that stitches all these together. So are there resources out there that help us do that type of thing that don't quite get to that level? Or do they have to look at and really understand it is a bigger investment they have to spend that energy and resources on?
Okay. So I can take a stab at it, but Jonathan or Tim, do you have a perspective that you go first?
Yeah, I mean, my gut is that the answer is a little bit of both, right? That there has to be a longer term strategy, really thinking about this investment. I think, Tim's kind of parting comments and my adding on to that, right? Like these regulations are yet another reason, right? Another weight on the scale that says we must make these investments, right? Not just for the constituent experience, not just for the sanity of our administrators at these different chapters, but also because of compliance. There's more argument for making that investment. But I think in terms of an iterative approach, you can get a lot of mileage out of just centralizing kind of identity management and having shared identifiers between orgs. So we've seen a lot of success with that in smaller ways, right? Like at a university where there's a recruiting org and they have access to the case management history for those recruits via Salesforce Connect because we have a shared identifier. The reality though is, right, getting a shared identifier that can be used in that way requires some kind of central hub where the chapter could reach in and say, hey, do we as an entire nonprofit, do we know this person? He just showed up at an event. He's in our system now, but do we already know about him? And a kind of a tie back to that. I think there's ways you could do that kind of on the cheap from a kind of an iterative perspective, but ultimately like that type of infrastructure does need to be in place in order to unlock all the good things that we're talking about here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, sir. Well, just to add a little bit to that, I think that Biz, what you're describing is it's a little bit outside the scope of this webinar. It's almost a level up. It's only, no, I'm not shutting you down. I just want to be like acknowledge that like we're almost at the point where you're saying, is an organization ready to take on a multi-org approach? And if they are, some indicators of that would be the ability to have an integration strategy or to have a CI/CD strategy where they could deploy changes across multiple orgs. Then if they said, yes, we're ready for that and we can manage that, a hub and spoke model for managing security across all those orgs is really smart. But maybe an organization doesn't have the appetite or the skill set today to do a multi-org strategy, so they should have single org for the time being. So I think that they're two interrelated but separate problems. That was my comment there.
And go ahead. No, Basil, I would add to that, like, what we were describing earlier in the hub and spoke. The thing that is really interesting to me in the hub and spoke model is like Salesforce, just by virtue of how things are priced, a hub org is pretty cheap, right? Like, sure, there is all kind of technology expertise required and all that. But if you're going to get an org with 10, 20, 30 licenses to just sort of orchestrate all this, there is probably few software offerings that can be that inexpensive, right? A hub org is not, I'm not buying 50,000 user licenses. So the thing that struck me about it, and I didn't really think about it up until, all of this, particularly Copado type CI/CD with hub started happening, that prerequisite hub org, I'm going, my God, that's not that expensive, because I need a very limited set of licenses. It's really administrator type people who are driving that. And if, we architected our solution primarily with the assumption that, our customers don't have an integration paraphernalia or infrastructure, right? So if they have a MuleSoft, awesome, we can work with that. If they don't, our thing would just work with basically REST APIs back and forth. So really, if you bought a hub org and you bought our product, you're basically done for the kind of use cases that we are addressing. But I would agree with what Tim is saying. Where we're going and the challenges that you're illustrating have been around for 20, 30 years in this whole master data management, customer master thing. And I have heard the story again and again in like 20 plus years of my being in this industry of let's just, solve this once for all. There've been MDM vendors of all types trying to do it. It just seems like a really intractable problem to, wrap our arms around. One of the key areas we spent so much time in architecting and designing this was to move away from a single identifier, because it just very, very few organizations have been able to approach that nirvana of one unified identifier. Probably higher ed has had some luck in it with, like some sort of a student identification. That's some luck.
Yeah, maybe.
Right. So to me, that when we were talking about that whole thing of how do you identify, that's a significant problem, even just in multiple Salesforce orgs inside an enterprise, right? We just identify the same person differently in different orgs. Is that, I don't know if you answered your question or just wore you down and basically like, yeah, whatever.
No. I mean, look, I acknowledge that my question was a little bit out of scope. I get that, right? I guess the reason I asked it is because this is all really important to be able to do these things. And we make the assumption that it's not, for me, it's not enough that they recognize, our customers recognize that they need to do this. It's, do they realize what it takes to make that happen? And how do we facilitate making it happen so that they can comply and so that they can even make these things occur? And that's why I asked the question that I did. It was because I was hopeful that there was some thought about that we could talk about. It seems like, I can circle up with Tim and other folks, and with y'all to talk more about that and what we can do. Because I think, in a lot of ways, it's going to be important for us because, like you said, this puts another weight on that side of the balance that says, you've got to do this. And it helps to drive home, the ways that we can continue to help our customers. And that's why I asked the question. I understand and appreciate that we're focusing more on regulatory compliance and stuff. But that slide with the CI and the CD with Capado, that set me off a little bit and made me want to ask about it. So anyway, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
And I guess like one kind of final thought on that, right? That same slide, right? Like if you look at like the first example of a hub, right, was kind of Salesforce Technologies itself. And there's been a journey with that where there's the promise of kind of pulling everything together into one unified customer 360 profile, but then the reality that you need an MDM solution to build that unified identifier. Safe Harbor, this is definitely a problem that Salesforce is working hard to solve. Our customer data platform technology, I think, is a giant step in that first direction, having a single place where we can kind of unify a constituent profile. So investments are being made in that. We had the Data Manager 360 attempt as well. So I think, Safe Harbor, longer term, this is clearly a problem to be solved that the Salesforce ecosystem is looking to kind of pull in. And that goes more to your kind of question about sharing data in a way that doesn't necessarily require a dev team to kind of come on board and build that out. So certainly as those technologies mature, a space to really watch that. And I think will be really interesting because I think that would go hand in glove with a hub and spoke model for privacy requests. Because if you have a customer data platform that has all this detailed information about someone's marketing interactions, you definitely still need a utility to be able to reach into that and clear that out and provide that information.
True. And in fact, just yesterday, Jonathan, Tim, and I were talking about, very much Basil, what you're referring to. There is a significant portion of education and enablement that needs to happen, right? To your point of like, how do we get our customers, to even sort of think or get further down that path of, and raising awareness and going, yes, this is a problem, yes, this needs to be done, and yes, we're not going to spend millions and millions of dollars. How can I even get to take the first sort of baby steps towards that realization?
Yep.
Yeah, great conversation. I know we are at time. Are there
pushed us over? I do it all the time. Sorry.
Good. I enjoy it. Are there any other questions that we can answer? I'm guessing. All right. Thank you everyone for your time. If you need to reach out, please do so. We did share the information here in the chat, so do copy it from there. We will, this session is getting recorded, so we will reach out and share a link to the recording. And appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Kim for your time, and thank you, Basil and Kim for adding color to this.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for organizing.
All right, cool.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.